Good evening and welcome. Thanks for coming out on a busy night on campus and a busy semester at UNLV. Of course, you see signs all over campus for the presidential debate, but we have a more important lecture and event here tonight, I would argue. Well, let's see if I'm proven correct. I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West. This is our first lecture of the semester, and we're really pleased to have a colleague, Ben Wittes, out here from Brookings making his first visit to us, not his first visit to Las Vegas. Ben's a senior fellow in government studies at Brookings and one of the authors of a recent report, Sextortion, Cybersecurity, Teenagers, and Remote Sexual Assault. That's not a phrase I thought I would be uttering as a young person, remote sexual assault. You're going to both see and hear some interesting information tonight, and Ben will talk. Our usual format, we'll have time for some Q&A at the end. Ben's PowerPoint is already up on our website, so you'll be able to refer to that. Thanks to our good friends here in the Greenspun College, the video of the lecture will also be up in a few days. So I'll turn things over to Ben.
So thanks for coming out. Not usually a big believer in trigger warnings, but I actually do feel an obligation with this subject to just say at the outset that this is some pretty ugly and disturbing stuff, and there's actually no way to talk about it constructively that doesn't implicate the ugly and disturbing content of it. So, if that's a problem for you, as they say on, NPR shows, sort of maybe this is the wrong lecture. But the incident that got me interested in this weird area called sextortion, and I'll come to the term in a little while, began with an email from an unknown sender with the subject line, "Read this and be smart." When the recipient of the email opened it, she found a bunch of sexually explicit photographs of herself attached to the email, and a whole lot of information that detailed where she worked, all kinds of issues related to her personal life. And following those details included information about her husband and 3 kids. And there was a demand attached to the letter. And so the demand is actually, I think, what makes this hack different from, as you might say, from all other hacks, right? So it was not a demand for money. And it wasn't a demand for access to accounts. It was a demand that the victim make a pornographic video of herself and send it to the perpetrator. And if she didn't do it by the end of one day, he threatened to publish the images that were already in his possession and, quote, let her family know about her dark side, unquote. If she contacted law enforcement, he would do the same thing. Later in the day, he followed up with a second email that said, "You have 6 hours." So this was one of a spree of such incidents that took place and that the FBI ended up investigating and tracing many, many different accounts, I think more than 30 different email accounts. But they all traced back eventually to the same set of computers in Santa Ana, California. And the FBI connected it to a young hacker named Luis Mijangos. And as they continued to investigate Mijangos, they soon realized that this was part of a much, much larger series of crimes that he was involved in. We can talk in detail about the Mijangos case, but basically what he was doing was breaking into people's webcams, turning the webcams against them, getting surreptitious video or images of them in various states of undress, and then using those images to demand that they produce pornography for his personal gratification. His threats were not idle. So in at least one case, he actually carried out a threat and posted nude images of a victim on a MySpace account of a friend of hers who he had also hacked after she refused to comply with the demands. And to make matters worse, he also used the computers he controlled. He also, by the way, because why not? He stole people's credit card information too. But he also used the computers he controlled to spread his malware further, propagating the malware to the victims' friends and contacts lists through their address books, through instant messages. So like any normal hacker, so that it would appear to come from friends and thereby induce more people to download the malware. Now, if this sounds familiar, it's because it's exactly the way all the hackers who do the normal sort of things we think of as cybersecurity behave. So in all, federal investigators found, these numbers are, I'm just going to read them because they're pretty astonishing, found more than 15,000 webcam video captures, 900 audio recordings, and 13,000 screen captures on his computers. Mijangos possessed files associated with 129 computers and roughly 230 people. Of those, 44 of his victims were determined to be minors. His scheme reached as far away as New Zealand. The videos he surreptitiously recorded showed victims in various states of undress, getting out of the shower, and having sex with partners. In addition to the intimate materials he seized from victims' computers, federal authorities also found credit card and other online account information consistent with identity theft. He sometimes passed this information along to co-conspirators around the world. Now, Mijangos was sentenced in June of 2010. He pled guilty to a single count of computer hacking, and he will be out of prison next year after serving a 6-year term. So this is a story that I ran across when I was researching a book that I wrote with my co-author, Gabby Bloom. And Gabby and I were writing a book about the future of violence, which is the title of the book. And we got interested in it because we were interested in futuristic threats like drone strikes and scary robots and cybersecurity and biotechnology. And we both come to it from this question from the national security space. So I am not a feminist lawyer or a child protection advocate or any of the other groups of people that I have found myself in working closely with ever since I kind of found this area. I am a cybersecurity and national security law person. And the more I thought about the Mijangos case, the more I thought this is a fascinating moment in human history that somebody in Los Angeles or Santa Ana can attack sexually someone in a different part of the world. And that is the first time, it's not merely the first time you could do that, it's the first time I think you could even think about it. There was another thing that really troubled me about the Mijangos case, which is that when we talk about serial prolific sex offenders, we're usually talking about a dozen people, 50 victims. That's a serious serial rapist, right? And this guy had managed in a very Silicon Valley kind of way to scale sexual violence. Think of him as the Uber of sexual violence, right? Uber doesn't own any cabs, but it's the biggest cab company in the world. And the reason is that the malware, or in their case, the software, is easily downloadable, portable, and it allows you to do it once. If you can do it once, you can do it 100,000 times. And so Gabby and I were puzzled by this question, is Mijangos unusual? Now, there was one really interesting indication in the Mijangos court documents that it might be something that was going on elsewhere too. And that's that the prosecutors had a word for it. And the word that they used was sextortion. And in the press releases associated with the Mijangos case, they had this word that implied that, this was something they'd seen before. And so Gabby and I, as part of our research in the Future of Violence book, we kind of started Googling sextortion cases and just what happens when you Google sextortion. And the answer to this question was really disturbing, which is that there were a lot of them. I mean, a whole lot of them. Like every community seemed to have a local news story about some creepy guy who had done some generally minor version, small-scale version of what Mijangos was a pro. I mean, he's really quite good. But some of these people, and what was interesting about these stories was that each of them was written as though this was the only case that had ever happened, that there was no sense that there was a larger connective fabric of a large number of these cases happening all over the place. So when Gabby and I finished The Future of Violence, I had made a kind of mental note that I wanted to come back to sextortion. And specifically, as I continued, as we tried to continue the research into it, a number of things really came to the fore in my mind. That is, I think, the reason that I've come to care about this issue a great deal. The first is that this is a story about the cybersecurity of non-powerful people. And when you talk about cybersecurity, when we talk about cybersecurity as a culture, we have a sense of what a cybersecurity victim is. A cybersecurity victim is the Office of Management and Budget, right? It's a major company with big intellectual property interests. It's a bank, right? It's a high net worth individual who might get his identity stolen. And here's what we don't think of as a cybersecurity target or victim. A 15-year-old girl, a 12-year-old boy, a 22-year-old girl, woman. We don't think of these people as cybersecurity targets or victims, and there's a very simple reason that we don't, and it's because we've misapprehended what they have to steal. So we look at the bank and we say that's a cybersecurity target because it has money to steal, it has, it's holding people's accounts. And we look at Sony and we say that's a cybersecurity target because they have, because they've offended the North Koreans, right? This is a vision of cybersecurity that's about the things that powerful institutions and powerful people have to protect. Now, when teenagers go out and walk in dangerous neighborhoods at night, we don't say, you don't have anything to steal to them. Don't worry about it. You can just kind of go do whatever you want in whatever neighborhood you want because you actually don't have anything to steal. That would be stupid. And it turns out that the sex offenders are a much more sophisticated group of in their cybersecurity thinking than we are, because they've figured out that the same things that people have to steal in the physical world, they have to steal, are available in the cyber world. And so the thing that I want you to take away from, if there's one thing you take away from this, it's that we've defined cybersecurity way, way too narrowly. And that there is such a thing as the cybersecurity of the non-powerful who do have things to steal. They have images of their bodies. They have the images the videos that they don't want to make, that they can be compelled to make. They have friend lists of other people just like them who have the same things to steal. And by the way, and this is a really big important point, teenagers are a really, really, really bad case for cybersecurity hygiene. They use bad passwords. They use the same passwords over and over and over again. And we don't care because we wrongly assume that there's nothing worth attacking in a teenager's set of accounts. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this, it's that we need to take the cybersecurity of teenagers and young adults much more seriously. Second thing, and this is a general point, a lot of the time when you say sextortion, people think you're talking about playful sexting. That's not what this is about. Kids sext. I don't actually, whether that's a good thing, a bad thing, a horrible, terrible thing, or whatever is not really the subject that I'm especially, it's sort of a question for social mores people, not for people like me. This is really not about that. This is a form of sexual exploitation. It's a form of coercion and violence. It can be incredibly brutal. We have, in the data set we amassed, we have multiple cases of suicide attempts among victims. We have cases in which the acts demanded of victims included self-mutilations of a particularly horrible sort. We have cases, multiple cases of people being forced to have sex with siblings, sometimes extremely young siblings. So what I want to emphasize is, don't think this is low grade, send me a picture of your breasts kind of stuff. There is that in here. There's a lot more than that in here. Okay. So one of the things that we learned as we started studying this is that nobody keeps good data on sextortion. It's actually really common, but nobody knows, including me, how common it is. We asked the government for its data on the subject, and they don't have any. They can't produce data on prevalence of sextortion. And the reason is, this is despite the fact that the Justice Department has said publicly, the FBI has issued serial warnings about this stuff. It's a acknowledged problem all over federal law enforcement. And you'll see why, which is that there are actually a lot of cases, but they don't get prosecuted as sextortion as such because sextortion as such doesn't exist. So the government can tell you how many child exploitation cases it's prosecuted. It can tell you how many hacking cases it's prosecuted. It can tell you how many stalking cases and how many extortion cases under 875D, which is the reputational side of sextortion. But if you ask them how many sextortion cases there are in the United States, nobody can tell you. And the best that anybody can do is the word lots. Everybody has a sense that there's a lot of them. So this is actually the first data set that's ever been constructed on the subject. And what we tried to do was, using a combination of that basic strategy of looking for news stories, using a sort of a basket of terms that conveyed sextortion cases, both looking at published cases and then using previously prosecuted cases to find antecedent cases. We were able to create a database of 78 prosecuted cases. The overwhelming majority of these cases are being prosecuted federally. And that's a really interesting fact, because most sex crimes are prosecuted locally. Federal government doesn't have general jurisdiction over rape, over sexual violence in general, but sextortion cases end up in federal court. And there's two big reasons for that. And first is, a lot of local police departments and a lot of local prosecutors don't care and don't take the problem seriously. Second reason is that a lot of local laws are really, really bad. One of my Sextortion prosecutor heroes is a woman named Coercion she's a state prosecutor in Wisconsin, and she's really devoted to these cases and has brought a lot of them. She has terrible laws to work with, and she's getting convictions, she's bringing cases, and she gets a few years here and there. As you'll see, it matters a lot whether you get prosecuted federally. The final reason that these cases are overwhelmingly federal is, to me, the most important when you think about it from the point of view of remote sexual violence, which is that these cases tend to be interstate and often international. These are people who are attacking each other, as with any other cybersecurity issue, over relatively long distances. 3 of the cases are foreign. One of them is actually the subject of an Israeli Supreme Court opinion. If you read the Israeli Supreme Court opinion, it is remarkable how much it sounds like this report. Whenever a legal system confronts one of these cases for the first time, there's this sense of, oh my God, this is really horrible. And that translates very well from Hebrew into English. There's also a Dutch case and a Mexican case in here. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about scaling and what it means to scale sexual violence. These 78 cases produced more than 1,300, nearly 1,400 victims. Now, they produced actually a lot more than that. So 1,397 is the number of people specifically identified by the FBI and the Justice Department in the court documents. So we have found X number of victims. And they'll show up in the court documents as victim 1, victim 2, victim 3, and a specific number of identified victims. In nearly all the cases, that represents a subset of what the prosecutors actually believed and the FBI investigation had concluded, but it's not worth identifying specifically all the victims. It's very time-consuming, labor-intensive to go around the country figuring out who all the victims are. So at the point at which you have enough to bring your case, you stop. And there'll be some estimate in one of the sentencing memos. We think there's actually 100 victims in this case. So we calculated a range of different ways to think about how many victims these included. The minimum, in my opinion, is around 3,000 victims, so more than twice the number of identified victims. It could be as high as 6,500, but here's the thing, it could be actually a lot higher than that. And the reason is that one case alone, which I'll talk about more specifically later, may have produced, the FBI has publicly stated that it was actually a sextortion team of a guy named Connolly and another guy named Ivory Dickerson, and they may have produced 3,800 victims between them alone. So think of this estimate range as 78 cases producing somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 victims. So figure out where in that range you want to think is the responsible range and divide it by 78. And what you'll see is that this is a form of sexual coercion and violence that you can actually do at scale. And I think that's an inherent feature of sort of internet life. It's an inherent feature of cybersecurity problems, right? That the first attack is hard. The second attack is trivially easy because you send the same code to a different place. And that's true if you're trying to steal, if you're the Chinese government trying to steal intellectual property. And it's just as true if you're Luis Mijangos trying to steal images of people who don't want to give you those images. All right, so outer edge, some of these cases produce a huge number of victims. 13 of them produce more than 100. 2 of the cases, and these are Ivory Dickerson and Leon Finkbeiner. And Finkbeiner is a terrifying, terrifying case. These produced, quote, hundreds, if not thousands of victims. Finkbeiner was interviewed by the FBI and actually said that he couldn't remember any of his victims individually. It was a robotic exercise on his part that he just tried to, they all blend together. All right, so what can we say about who the sextortionists are? All right, there's nothing you can say about who the sextortionists are except that men suck. I am waiting and waiting and waiting to find the first female sextortionist. There is nothing, there don't seem to be any women even facilitating the perps. So I think the best way to understand this is it's three distinct groups of men. There's no age demographic, there's no demographic category beyond male that says anything. But there is three, I think, distinct groups of men. One is the lone creep behind a computer who's just spending all of his time compulsively doing this. The second is the hands-on sexual abuser who's doing this along with all kinds of other stuff. Now, these people are strangely networked. The FBI recently busted a child pornography site called, of all things, Playpen, where in order to get in to be a member of Playpen, you had to provide new child pornography material. So there's a very deep, there's a very deep relationship among this category of child sex offender between the production and the network sharing of material. So these people do tend to be in touch with one another, sometimes knowing who one another are and sometimes not. So those are less loner-like. They're more sort of not an organized criminal gang, but they're kind of gangs of networked creeps. And then the third category, which is I think really different, is what you might call an intimate abuse case. These are people who have generally very few victims, sometimes only one. They're people who are obsessed with a single person. In two of our cases, they're fathers or stepfathers who are sextorting their daughters living in their house, or stepdaughters. And these are highly, highly targeted at an individual. All right, so what can we say about the victims? The victim profile is much more complicated than the perp profile. So on the easy side, the adult victims are essentially all female. I have seen a couple cases where in a very large pool of sextortion victims, that are mixed gender and mixed age, there's an occasional guy over 18. But by and large, if the victims are going to be more than 18, if the person's targeting adults, he's targeting women. And we should, I think, definitely think of this as a new category of violence against women. Again, we can get to whether violence, given the distance and the remoteness, is the appropriate word, but whatever it is, it's against women. Now, the problem is that relatively few of the cases involve adults, at least principally. So 85% of our cases involve at least some minor victims, and more than 70% of the cases involve only minor victims. So principally, this is a problem of targeting kids. And a lot of those kids are boys. And it's there's two groups of boys who are really vulnerable. One is the gay kid who shows up on a website for the first time, or relatively early in a process of coming out. There's some of the sextortionists really preyed on that. The second is a lot of the sextortionists pose as teenage girls, and they get teenage boys to send them something. So that's an area that affects straight boys. But there's a particular problem, I think, in the case of not yet out people in teenagers in communities where that would not be acceptable. So before I get to the modalities of sextortion, I should have said this earlier. I want to say a few words about what sort of cases we did and didn't include in this study. So it is one of the problems with putting this data set together is that there's absolutely no social agreement about what sextortion is and what counts as it. So sexual extortion is old as the day is long, and people have been demanding things of each other in exchange for not revealing their sexual indiscretions or that sort of information. There's even a Sherlock Holmes story about it. And although the picture in question is exceedingly tame. So the question is, at what point do you say, hey, this is part of something that's new? And at what point do you say, well, it's not? So as we were looking at these cases, there are a whole bunch of them that involve what I call commercial sextortion. So there are these call centers in the Philippines that are running this scam. It's very similar to the ransomware scam. And the way it works is, this is targeted almost entirely at men, by the way. Women don't fall for it. So you're trolling around on the internet, and a beautiful young woman in some sort of skimpy outfit friends you on Facebook or follows you on Twitter. And then sends you a tantalizing message of some sort. You get to chatting, and before you know it, she has sent you a nude picture of herself. And then before you know it further, she has asked you for one of yourself. Now, a surprising number of men turn out to respond to this by sending a nude picture of themselves, only then to find out that the woman, the beautiful young woman, is actually a call center in the Philippines that wants $15,000 in order not to release the pictures. The good news, in case you ever get caught up in this scam, is that the call centers tend to be honorable about it. They don't want it to get out that that you pay them and get screwed anyway. So they do tend to, but this form of sextortion is prevalent enough that the Navy Criminal Investigative Service had to issue guidance to U.S. service personnel that to the effect that the young woman who's asking for a racy picture of you is in fact a call center in the Philippines. And there's had to be a lot of public education of U.S. troops. If you Google this, you will find news stories all over the country about people getting caught up in this scam. An Illinois state representative just had to resign. So this kind of sextortion is exceedingly common, and we ignored all of it for purposes of this study. So for us, so the question of what you are and aren't going to include is actually a really hard one, and there's a lot of, we can talk about the sort of some of the methodological judgments we made. We define sextortion as follows. Sextortion is old-fashioned extortion or blackmail carried out over a computer network involving some threat, generally but not always a threat to release sexually explicit images of the victim if the victim does not engage in some form of further sexual activity. So there are outlying cases that push that definition, and we had to figure out which cases we're in and which cases are out. To create that list of 78 required a lot of judgment calls that I fully concede other people may have made differently. The reason I mention this is that when I talk about these numbers, keep in mind that if you make some of those methodological decisions differently from the way we did, the numbers explode. So if you include the commercial sextortion, the numbers are astronomically bigger than what we're reporting. we define things in a pretty conservative fashion. Okay, so how does it work? What's the modality of sextortion? So the lion's share of the cases are not Mijangos-like hackers. Those are sort of the high-end, cool sextortionists. The low-grade, garden variety sextortionists engage in an activity which we call social media manipulation, but is colloquially known as catfishing. And catfishing is basically you pose as somebody other than yourself, you trick somebody into doing something they don't want to do, you take advantage of it. So catfishing involves 85% of all of these cases, and it's essentially it's the overwhelmingly dominant thing in the way the kids are being targeted. So the hacking cases are a much, much smaller percentage, but notice that there are a substantial percentage of the cases involving adults. The adults are much less likely to get tricked into sending you a picture of themselves. You probably have to steal it. Now, there's two forms of computer hacking that are at issue here. One is the high-grade stuff that Mijangos is doing, which is cam hacking. And that's, that requires a certain level of sophistication. It doesn't require an enormous level of sophistication. And fortunately, if you want to engage in it, there's a lot of YouTube videos that will show you how to do it. Hacking people's webcams this is not a complicated attack. But the easier attack still is to figure out people's passwords and hack their accounts. Many people have images of themselves locked in a Google storage area, Google Drive, in a private area of a Dropbox, and this is just exceedingly common in a certain age demographic. And the passwords that protect this material are as weak as teenagers and young adults' average password, so one of these whole cases arises because a guy is able to guess large numbers of passwords from all the girls he went to high school with. And so he was able to just sort of guess what people's passwords would be, and he stole all kinds of stuff. All right, so this is the part that I think is genuinely different from anything that we've ever seen in human history before. Nearly all these cases are interstate. Now, in the past, when we've talked about interstate violence, interstate sexual, improprieties, we're generally talking about human transport, right? The Mann Act. You're talking about sort of interstate prostitution rings. You're not talking about sometimes you're talking about kidnappings, right? You're generally not talking about attacks that themselves cross state lines. But this is, more than 60% of our cases involve a substantial interstate element. A lot of the cases involve a lot of jurisdictions. And 16 of the cases, there's at least one victim in a different country than the perpetrator. So, this raises a really interesting problem when you are, as a victim, confronted by this. Who do you go to, right? And your local police department is probably very badly positioned to investigate, depending on the case, depending on the circumstance, may be very badly positioned to deal with this. And some of the forensic activity really requires a law enforcement agency with a greater scope of capability. All right, so sextortion, because the crime doesn't exist as such, it gets prosecuted under a very disparate set of laws. These are all federal, by the way. So when the victim is a kid, or when a victim or substantial group of victims is a kid, The child pornography statutes and the child exploitation statutes are extremely powerful instruments. For those of you who've never spent quality time with the child pornography statutes, they have 15-year mandatory minimums associated with them. And so if you go down for child pornography, you're going to prison for a very, very long time. So what you'll see is that a very large percentage of the cases involve these child pornography, child exploitations. And the 2242 statute is a very interesting one for purposes of sextortion because it criminalizes the enticement or coercion of a minor to engage in activity. And so you actually don't have to be involved in the activity itself, and it doesn't have to have produced visible material that would bring it under the child pornography statutes. All right, so here's the problem. The problem is that if you're a smart sextortionist, you don't go after children. You go after adults. And if you go after adults, you fall into this weird lacuna. So it's not a sexual assault because you haven't assaulted anybody. All these sexual assault laws all require some, physical hands-on element. Some of them require a threat. Well, a threat is adequate, but it has to be a threat of violence. And so if you're not in the same state with somebody, and what you're threatening is a reputational harm, you have almost never violated a sexual assault, rape, or sexual abuse law. So what you see is that the workhorse statute ends up being an interstate extortion statute. Now, the interstate extortion statute, the problem with it is that the maximum sentence on the part of the statute that deals with reputation. So if the nature of the threat is to damage somebody's reputation, that is actually a very weak sentencing. And the reason, if you think about it, is how much time would you want somebody to go to jail for going to the head of a company and saying, hey, I have pictures of you with a woman, not your wife. Give me 10 grand and I won't release them. And you think that's sort of like a 2, 3, 4-year felony, right? And that's what the statute reflects, which is that instinct about, and so deploying it for this purpose actually ends up being a little bit, it ends up producing very weak stuff. Ditto with the hacking and identity theft laws. Mijangos went down for, a 1030 violation. We think of that as computer crime. And, you get 6 years for computer crime. You don't get 6 years for sexually assaulting or whatever 230 people. So the result is really dramatic sentencing disparities. And they're really dramatic. And they're dramatic across 3 different axes. The first is, if you're a sextortionist, I'm just going to frame this as advice, because if you can't laugh about this stuff, you end up crying. If you're a sextortionist, make sure you get prosecuted by the states, not by stay out of federal court if you can. We found a case in Rhode Island which had 22 underage boys as victims. The perp will spend a year in prison. It's, some of the states have some people who've worked extremely hard on this. The community that is mobilized around the issue of non-consensual pornography is principally mobilized around the issue of revenge porn. And so the statutes that they've lobbied for, and they've gotten now in 27 states, are largely non-responsive to this problem. I don't want to criticize them for that, because the revenge porn problem is a real problem. But there is a real statutory problem at a lot of the state level. All right, so as you'll see, second bullet point here, there's a huge difference between if you get prosecuted with a minor victim and if you get prosecuted with an adult victim. It's a giant factor difference. Now that's true of all sex crimes at the federal level, that there's a, federal law takes child pornography extremely seriously. But I would suggest that here you have a different problem, which you see in the third point, which is that it is not taking violence against adults seriously enough. And I don't think that's because anybody did anything malicious in federal law. What you'll see is the hands-on sexual abuse, violence cases get pretty robust sentences, an average of about 230 months. But this lacuna that I described in the previous slide is really causing a problem for the sextortionists who are smart enough or lucky enough only to have adult victims. All right, so what do you do about it? In our report, we actually broke out a principal recommendation as its own paper, in which we tried to write a model federal statute to address those sentencing disparities and to try to create a working definition of sextortion, sort of operationalized in statutory language. I won't go into the details of that, but if anybody's interested, there's a lengthy paper on the subject. Most important immediate thing is the federal government needs to start keeping data about this. That is a very hard thing to do because you need a definition. When the paper came out in May, Senator Boxer from California wrote a letter to the Attorney General asking what data the Justice Department could provide, and Attorney General Lynch wrote a bizarre letter in response saying, we take this problem extremely seriously, we can't provide any data. I don't doubt that they take it extremely seriously. There are people both at the Bureau and at the Justice Department who are passionately committed to this as an issue, and we spent a lot of time with them both before and after the report came out. The policy leadership is, there needs to be some high-level decisions to deal with this and a directive to sort of figure out the data problem so that we can get a sense of how much bigger it is than what I've reported. It's the tip of an iceberg. I have an instinct about the size of the iceberg. You don't make policy on the basis of an instinct. Finally, I have one, I do think of all the major actors in this space, there is one that has made an unaccountable decision that really needs to be thought about, and that's the decision of hardware manufacturers to install webcams without shields, webcams that are entirely software driven. So on your phone, you have a switch that will turn off the ringer, but there is no switch that will turn off the webcam. That webcam is entirely software driven. And I think the hardware manufacturers have a lot to answer for here. Most people have a laptop in their bedrooms open at night. That's because we watch Netflix in bed before we go to sleep, right? And when you're done, the likelihood that you don't close the computer, that you put it off on a nightstand sometime, is not trivial. And that's a real cybersecurity vulnerability that all of us are walking around with every day, and that this group of people really preys upon. So I'm going to stop there. I actually went longer than I expected to, for which I apologize. And so if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to address any of them.
We do have time for a question or two. Ooh, excuse me for that. Let me thank you, Ben, for your leadership in this field and for putting it in a context for us. And last call, please. Yeah.
Question: the revenge porn crossed out and perhaps reformulated to take this into account?
So I wouldn't want anything to say that I said to suggest that I think we should throw out the revenge porn statute. The revenge porn statutes are responsive to a different problem than the sextortion problem. And I think trying to tailor the revenge porn statutes to address sextortion is probably not a great idea. The revenge porn statutes are almost exclusively concerned with the unconsenting release of consensually produced material. And that's a problem that implicates how and to what extent you can restrain publication, right? So think of the revenge porn statutes as, you know, a descendant of the Brandeisian kind of right to privacy vision, right? And they're principally going to be, you know, civil torts. There's a criminal element to them, but they're largely about publication of existing material, most of which was produced consensually. Sometimes it's not, but that's not the lion's share of the problem. This is about the non-consensual production of material. And it's a very different problem. And the revenge porn folks often try to kind of wedge it in. And I think they're making, to the extent they do that, I think it's a mistake. I think the core issue here is the threats and the forced production of material under threat. And I think neither of those is the subject that a revenge porn statute, at least as most legislatures have envisioned it, have construed, you know, have addressed.
You mentioned that you've worked on a model statute to address this, since this is different and this is something that needs to be addressed in a different way. What does an ideal sentencing look like based on that?
So this is a crazy hard question, and I think it requires we copped out. So I'll tell you what we did, and I'll tell you why it's a cop-out, which was we slapped a maximum per count sentence of 15 years on the highest grade stuff that we did, that we looked at. And the theory here was that a single act of sextortion, like a sexual assault that does not produce a serious bodily injury, should, in federal law, such a sexual assault is generally capped around 15 years. And so we sort of capped it out there. Here's why it's a cop-out. There is, and the theory behind it was that these sentences would not group. And so if you did lots and lots of acts, the time would rack up really quickly. And so the problem is that there is absolutely no agreement among the prosecutors, the FBI agents, the victims' advocates about what the proper metaphor for this stuff is. Is a single act of this like a single sexual assault? Is it like a revenge porn violation? And if you ask 10 different people who care about this issue, you won't get 10 different answers, but you'll really get a divide between the people who think this is just like violence in the physical world, it's just not in the physical world, and people who think, no, there's something profoundly different about hands-on sexual violence. It doesn't correlate by anything that I can't predict based on knowing somebody how they're going to feel about that issue. And I think until you have an instinct, a sort of shared instinct about how bad we think Act X of this is, it's very hard to assign a particular numerical number of years. So what we figured was write something that would allow the amassing of very large amounts of time if you did it a lot, but would also allow, for those cases that are just, a single send me a picture of you without any clothes, without a sort of sustained form of coercion over time, would allow something to be a relatively lenient sentence. So no mandatory minimum, but a relatively high potential maximum. Am I satisfied with it? No.
Maybe we'll end on that note and try and end on time like we always do. Thanks again for coming. We'll be back next week, but Thursday of next week. If you can pick up our printed schedules and calendars outside. It's also on our website. We'll have our colleague Michael Hansen out from Brookings. Michael's an expert on K through 12 education, so we'll be looking at a quite timely topic here in Clark County as our school district undergoes some potentially significant change. Thanks again for coming.